with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Tuesday, June 11th, 2019. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America. Downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Oxford University, Ruben Andersson. On No-Go World, how fear is redrawing our maps and infecting our politics. Also on the program today, federal judge orders the last abortion clinic in Missouri open for at least 2 more weeks. House passes IRS reform bill, killing the so-called free file program, which was a giveaway to tax preparation services. Meanwhile, Warren Buttigieg on the move in Iowa, Bernie marches with workers, and Joe Biden still thinks the fever will break.
They know better.
Jared Kushner's business got $90 million over the past 2 years from unknown offshore investors. Just that, folks.
It's working and it's very exciting.
It's getting really good. Wow.
New York may be the first state in the country to decriminalize sex work. And South Carolina wants to add work requirements for Medicaid. Democrats pull a congressional pay raise bill because of pushback. And Reince Priebus joined the Navy. All this and more on today's program. Yes, that's not a huge story, Reince Priebus. You all remember Reince Priebus. He was the former chair of the Republican National Party. Then became chief of staff, the first chief of staff for the Trump administration. And I don't know. It doesn't say in this. I haven't seen any elaboration on this. But here's an image.
I'm going to a very ad hoc place in my thinking right now.
Sean Spicer tweeted out an image of Reince Priebus in his naval uniform getting sworn in by Mike Pence. So Priebus, age 47, he joined the Navy. He joined the Navy, and apparently he was commissioned after a process in where former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis recommended him, and a board of officers selected him as a reserve officer. And he says, I remembered my sister served as a Navy doctor, and my father taught at the naval station. And he felt called to serve after an Oval Office meeting in which Trump met with his wife and children of Senior Chief Petty Officer William Ryan Owens, a Navy SEAL officer who was killed in a special operations raid in Yemen. So he was professionally recommended by a board, with 4 others to join the service through a competitive direct commission program for human resources officer. I for the life of me, I don't know exactly what's behind this. I just hope that it is an indication that if you work for the Trump administration, no one will hire you in the civilian world.
I wanted to lobby Bear to make it easier to put toxins in the waterways. They wouldn't give you a damn thing. The whole thing is garbage.
Maybe he just wants to see the world.
Or maybe
get away from his surprisingly hot wife.
I've always wanted to see the Orient. What the hell is surprising about it?
That story is complete garbage.
But that's, I hope that's what it is. But I don't think that it's only that. There may be other things involved in this. Meanwhile, on the Hill yesterday, the House Judiciary Committee heard testimony from former White House counsel John Dean, who was obviously Richard Nixon's White House counsel, went on to write extensively about Nixon and about authoritarians in our government. That was 10, 15 years ago. He saw that the Republican Party was actually turning authoritarian. Saw the indications of that happening. And he's been, brought on various capacities as a commentator. I'm not sure I fully get why. I understand the sort of the thinking, but it really is one-dimensional thinking and too clever by half, I think, by the Democrats to do this. But it may be the best that they could do with Nancy Pelosi, and we will talk about Nancy Pelosi. We have that clip of her at P. Peterson. Right? Oh, God. Anyways, so in lieu of impeachment hearings, we're getting this, which is apparently just to set the table. Now, of course, it did create some attention, and wherever there's attention, there is milkshake Matt Gaetz. Matt Gaetz loves a slushie on a hot Florida day. He is from the Florida Panhandle, and here he is questioning John Dean. He doesn't do a terribly good job, but he does get humiliated. And how do we know that Matt Gaetz felt he got humiliated? I will tell you after the clip.
Do you have personal knowledge regarding the truth or falsity of a single material fact in the Mueller report?
I think if you recall, the first thing I said, I'm not here as a fact witness.
You're here to provide historical context.
Exactly.
And throughout history, you accuse presidents of acting like Richard Nixon, and you make money off of it, right?
Not all presidents, no.
Well, but a few more than one.
Those who do act like him, I pointed out.
Let me ask you this question. How do Democrats plan to pay for Medicare for all?
I'm sorry?
Well, I figured if we were going to ask you about stuff you don't know about, we'd start with the big stuff. So do you know how they plan to pay for Medicare for all?
Who? The Democrats, or which candidate, or can you be more specific?
Let's get specific to Nixon, since that appears to be why you're here. Do you believe?
Well, actually, Nixon did have a health care plan.
Good. Well, do you believe if we turned the lights off here and maybe lit some candles, got out a Ouija board, we could potentially raise the specter of Richard Nixon?
I doubt that.
Well,
So now,
sounded much better in front of the mirror, Matt.
Right. Matt Gaetz thought he was, and basically he tried like 3 or 4 different tacks. I'm going to go to this. John Dean may actually know how these candidates are going to pay for their health care, and I certainly don't want that to happen. So let's talk about Nixon. Oh, Nixon had a health care. And they all laughed at Matt Gaetz. And what's even more important than my assessment that they all laughed at Matt Gaetz is Matt Gaetz's assessment that they laughed at Matt Gaetz. And how do I know that Matt Gaetz felt they all laughed at him? Because there is no intern in Matt Gaetz' office who would have made the decision on their own to edit that video and release it and hide the fact that John Dean owned Matt Gaetz in this exchange. Here is the video that has been put out by Matt Gaetz. This is eerie, folks. Eerie. 50,000 people have watched this, and they're missing the part where Matt Gaetz gets metaphorically slushied.
How they plan to pay for Medicare for all?
Who? The Democrats or which candidate? Or can you be more specific?
Let's get specific to Nixon, since that appears to be why you're here. If we turned the lights off here and maybe lit some candles, got out a Ouija board, we could potentially raise the specter of Richard Nixon.
There you go. They cut out that whole moment.
They made it sound as if people were chuckling at his weak joke.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because they got the tail end of the laughter. Here's the part again.
Appears to be why you're here. If we turned the lights off here...
Specific?
Let's get specific to Nixon, since that appears to be why you're here. If we turned the lights off...
Orwellian, man.
Let's get specific to skipping me humiliating myself in a spectacular fashion.
Calling Vic Berger.
I'm worried that...
Forget Vic Berger. This should be all over the news in Florida. I mean, that is pretty stunning that he would edit it that way.
Doctor in the public record.
Yeah, it really is. And there's 50,000 people who watched his version already. 50,000 people, and you can bet a lot of those are his constituents. Folks, one of today's sponsors is Skillshare. Anyone who goes to skl.sh/Majority Report 4 is going to get 2 whole months of totally free access to Skillshare's entire library of super quality online courses and tutorials. Skillshare is a vibrant online learning community that offers courses on everything from design to video editing, photography, business, technology, cooking, meditation, everything in between. There are Skillshare courses for everyone. You'll have no problem finding courses that are going to be useful for you both in your personal life and your professional life. Whether you want to sharpen your skills with something you already love doing, or you want to learn how to do something totally new, Skillshare has you covered. They have courses for entrepreneurs, courses on computer coding, web development, personal nutrition. You can learn new languages, Photoshop. Check this one out. So anyway, I went to my Skillshare page. Welcome back, Sam. Ready for your next lesson. Here's the amazing thing. One, they gave me 2 options. One is intro your business social media strategy. I haven't taken that course, but I've been talking about courses like that. And the other one is lucid dreaming. Nice. But then they recommended some other ones for me, and they're all actually completely on point. Get unstuck, best procrastination once and for all, although I'm actually getting better at that. I just have no time anymore. Social media for creatives. A great social media strategy. Here's the best one. Here's the one that is the least likely, I would imagine, that someone would predict I would want. But make ahead breakfasts that will change your day.
That is very predictable.
Because I got to do this for the kids.
Highly predictable.
I got to do this for the kids. Anything I can prep to get ahead of my day, that's what I will do. But it gives you a whole range of different courses. And I've been happy with every single one I've watched. You can get 2 entire months of free access to every single course offered by Skillshare by going to skl.sh/Majority Report 4. Just think of everything you're going to have at your fingertips for 2 whole months. Again, that's skl.sh/Majority Report 4. I put a link underneath this video. If you're watching on YouTube, it is, of course, going to be in the podcast description. Ladies and gentlemen, just a reminder, this program relies on your support. Sometimes we get a lot of members, and other times we don't get a lot of members. We're going through a little bit of a dry spell. So any type of support, if you listen to this show on a regular basis and you want to continue to, or you want to support it, help it grow and continue on, jointhemajorityreport.com. Jointhemajorityreport.com for just literally 35 cents a day. We've done the math before. I don't know why we can't remember it. 35 cents a day.
I thought it was 35 cents a day.
I think it's like 36 or 37. I don't know. But it doesn't matter.
Under 40 cents a day.
Under 40 cents a day, ladies and gentlemen. You can support this program every day. Go to Join the Majority Report. When you do, we give you extra content and we make it commercial free. So jointhemajorityreport.com. Going to take a quick break. When we come back, I'm going to be talking to Professor Ruben Andersson on on No-Go World, How Fear is Redrawing Our Maps and Infecting Our Politics. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program anthropologist and associate professor at Oxford University, author of, or his latest, I should say, is No-Go World, How Fear is Redrawing Our Maps and Infecting Our Politics. Ruben Andersson, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Now, this is a follow-up to Illegality, Inc., a clandestine migration and the business of bordering Europe, which was largely an ethnography of migrants. And how did that book lead to this one?
Right. So I was working as an anthropologist on undocumented migration towards Europe from West Africa for many years. So that was what my first book was about. This is obviously a huge story in the news right now. Border security, fighting irregular migration, that kind of thing. We're seeing that at both the US-Mexico border and in Europe, and that's the story of my first book. So I was following border guards and their attempts to crack down on migration, build fences, launch patrols, including on African territory. And I was following migrants in the borderlands trying to cross these borders. So the new book, No-Go World, is about the same part of the world to some extent, about West Africa and the conflict, insecurity, instability that's hitting this part of the world right now. And I guess one thing that ties the two together is really this issue of migration and the politics of fear surrounding what's seen as uncontrolled migration from poorer countries towards the West. The way in which this ties into particular mapping of the world, into zones that are seen as sources of dangers, of threats coming towards Western borders. So I look at this both in the case of the US-Mexico border in the book and in the case of Europe, where we're seeing more and more investments in border security, more and more wall building and similar types of controls rolled out to halt these kinds of movements.
You talk about sort of red zones and green zones. Just just so that we are all on the same page. Like what does that mean? Literally.
You may recall the old Baghdad green zone during the Iraq invasion, the idea of a bunkered up part of the city that's set apart from local society, where it's very difficult to enter for any locals. I think in a way we're seeing a globalization of this idea of the green zone today on a global scale, including at our borders, where we're gating up our borders, trying to keep outsiders away, anything that's seen as dangerous to our territories. Outside then lies the red zone, and we see that depicted very clearly on various kinds of risk advisories. If you go to the State Department or if you go to any foreign ministry website in Europe, you'll see maps of the world that are covered in red blotches of danger. Huge parts of Africa, parts of Mexico, Central America, large chunks of Central Asia are now no-go zones, out of reach, as it were, parts of the world we shouldn't go to. So we're seeing increasingly this division of the world, a peculiar mapping of the world into zones of safety and danger, in this sense, red and green zones. And I think this says something about our moment, this anxiety and fear that we see in our domestic politics in Western countries. And we also see, I think, here an echo of earlier times, even our colonial times, pre-colonial times, in the ways in which certain parts of the world were imagined back then. And part of what I do in this new book is to head back into history and see what we can learn from those earlier times.
Yeah, what I mean, give us a sense of those maps. Like how? So there was. I mean, I feels like the maps in the pre-colonial times would not be. They would not be red or green. There would just be maybe a question mark. Right, as opposed to, I mean, is that? I mean, how would you characterize if you were to oversee the? I mean, I guess to generalize the evolution of these maps, and these are obviously done from the perspective of largely of the West. What would that evolution mean? What would it look like, both literally, but also what was the subtext behind that?
Yeah. So first, to discuss the subtext there, it's important to point out that the mapping of the world, which I talk about centrally in this book, is not simply about depicting the world around us. It's a way of narrating our place in the world, of leaving out certain things, emphasizing others, telling a story about our place, wherever we are in that world. And it's also a way of justifying certain kinds of interventions in that world. And we see that going back all the way to medieval times. And what I look at in the book is the history of Western mapping to some extent. Maps of the worlds in medieval Christendom that situated Jerusalem at the centers, and far away on the margins you saw these monstrous figures adorning the edges of the known world. In a way, the blank spaces you're referring to there, they were imagined as inhabited by these strange, monstrous creatures. Here be dragons is that old phrase we often hear. Often the maps didn't say that, but they had all these beastly traces sort of written into the margins. And that persisted into colonial times. We see how in the early colonial periods, those blank spaces become spaces to conquer, spaces to understand, spaces to go out there and define and remap, as it were. And it's ironic that in the high colonial era we see maps of the British Empire, for instance, where all the red zones indicate zones of colonial control. Those were the parts of empire. The empire painted itself red, as George Orwell said. Well, today the red zones on our map indicate danger, they indicate lack of control. And they indicate, I think, a retreat as well. A retreat and a selective withdrawal of Western powers away from parts of the world where they have long sought to exert their dominance.
tell us what about the Timbuktu syndrome, because much of what you're talking about, at least in the context of when we I guess in Africa, anyways, is around Mali.
Yes. Yeah, I spent some time in Mali for research for this book, where we've seen a conflict ongoing in the past years, and sadly violence is now spreading across the country and across the whole West African region into neighboring countries as well. This was a conflict that started in 2012 with a separatist uprising in the desert north of the country, around the ancient town of Timbuktu, of course, that's so well known as this epitome of remoteness in the Western imagination, one of those blank spaces on the map that in the 19th century European explorers set out to visit and map and eventually through colonialism to conquer. So we're seeing in this part of the world insecurity, danger, threats of various kinds mapped out through different kinds of interventions. We have counter-terror interventions, we have border security operations, peacekeeping mission, and so on. And when I talk about,
can you just for the sake of our audience, those types of interventions, can you just flesh them out just a little bit so that people have an understanding of what typically had been, what those interventions took form, because they're not simply military, and they're all not, I guess, I mean, arguably, but they're not necessarily imperialistic. Although for the to a large extent, I guess maybe they are. But will you just outline those for us?
On the one hand, since the Bush era, we've seen the war on terror extended into the Sahara Belt, the Sahel-Sahara Belt in Africa, through counter-terror initiatives starting already around the time of the Iraqi invasions. That's an old thing in a sense. It's been going on for a long time. And since that time, the early 2000s, we've seen an emergence and proliferation of jihadist groups and other militias and armed insurgent groups in the region. So that's one part of the story. And we then also have the French, the former colonial power in the region, coming in with its own counter-terror mission in this part of the world that overlaps as well, quite uneasily, one can say, with concerns about migration in Europe. So even when this counter-terror mission is motivated officially in France, it's said to be about controlling a danger zone where all types of smuggling are taking place. It's partly to do with stabilizing this part of the world to ensure that migrants and displaced people don't move onwards to some extent. We then have border security, and this was also what I wrote about in my first book. More and more European Union funding, different European states investing in this part of the world, sending troops to some extent, but also police forces into the region. A lot of money going into the coffers of government, often with little democratic oversight, and directly into funding things like border posts, vehicles, all sorts of security equipment in countries such as Mali and neighboring Niger. That is risking real escalation of the problem if the security apparatus of these states just keeps on being strengthened with few democratic controls. And besides all that, you have a UN peacekeeping mission, which clearly has more benevolent objectives attached to it, but that's seen itself in huge trouble in this part of the world, with record fatalities taken, mainly by African troops who are out there patrolling the front lines in the desert north of the country with very little protections in a mission of uncertain end and facing increasing attacks by jihadist and insurgent groups. It's a very unstable part of the world right now where all sorts of security operations are converging in a very uneasy way, and that's partly what I get at when I talk about this Timbuktu syndrome in this part of the world. A way of intervening that's concerned with controlling various kinds of transnational danger in these far-flung, remote places of the globe, but that often are premised on not actually fully entering these zones, of operating in them at a remove through the remote controls from the inside walls of bunkers and headquarters and via drones and proxy forces and so on.
So, okay.
We've seen in this part of the world it's not quite working out.
Well, all right. So what you're describing to us is this notion of a sort of a, and we're seeing actually, I mean, you can draw maybe more of a straight line, arguably, with what Donald Trump purportedly was trying to get out of Mexico, which is to stop immigrants coming not necessarily from across the Mexican-American border, but the Mexican and Guatemalan border, and to stop the flow of immigrants and basically to leverage stuff that was happening internally there. And I want to turn our focus to that more specifically in a moment. But the syndrome you're describing is a fear that's on the margins on some level, but in some way our interventions are done in a more are done in such a remote way that it makes these things more marginal and also more dangerous.
That's probably a good summary of it. Yeah, it's a bit of an echo of the Vietnam syndrome, if we'll bring that term in as well. The idea that the United States didn't want to risk its soldiers' lives in military escapades abroad after the large fatalities sustained in Vietnam. And we're clearly seeing an echo of that today. And that's partly why I talk about a syndrome here, in that we're seeing a reluctance, a political reluctance, a risk aversion to put large numbers of boots on the ground, to put in place a large-scale, say, military civilian mission in these far-flung parts of the world. Instead, the idea is that we are now using these new capabilities to intervene remotely through technology, through drones, surveillance, but also through collaborations with partner regimes, partner states, as we've seen in the case of migration in Mexico and Central America, and as we're seeing in the case of both migration and counter-terror in the Sahel and the Sahara. This is an old technique that was there already in colonial times, I should say, and it's not quite working out. We're rather seeing often uncontrolled, unchecked resources spreading into often very unaccountable regimes, and that often risk escalating the problem over the long term. There's less and less of a sense of control over what's happening on the ground, and the powerful interveners in their headquarters, military headquarters, policing headquarters, in the West or in bunkers in the field, often have a very limited view of what's going on there. And it's that separation, that withdrawal, that distancing that I think should concern us deeply.
I mean, I understand the dynamic you're describing, which is, we're trying to intervene, but on some level, it's sort of like a one-size-fits-all. It's not done as a sort of like an experience that is shaped by an understanding of what's actually happening there, by interacting with people. But I'm unclear as to like what is it that we're doing. I mean, what is the central problem? Is it the intervention? Is it the mode of intervention? Is it that you're suggesting here, or is it that we have done things that have created problems on the margins? Because it's also possible, and I'm not sure, of the perspective on how this is problematic, because there have been those, back in the early 90s, in this country, the neocons, the Project for a New American Century, proposed to a large extent a lot of what we're seeing now. It didn't necessarily work out in the way that they thought it would, it would create this sort of like American hyperpower hegemony by, unchallenged hegemony, because in envisioning a series of low-level conflicts all around the world that were low-level enough that it kept people busy. It created some busy work for people in terms of, but nobody ever amassed power to challenge the United States. I don't know that the second part actually worked out from the perspective of those people, but certainly the first part seems to be there, right? I mean, if you pour enough guns, you start selling enough guns, and you're willing to sort of like, drop with drones or, packets of money or whatever, you can create some instability and, still control it, have a certain amount of controlled chaos.
Yes, controlled chaos is a good word for it. And I do go back in the book, actually, to the early post-Cold War moment when the neocons came out in force and said, we need to go abroad in search for monsters to destroy. And in a way, what we've seen since that time, that search for a post-Cold War enemy to take the place of the Soviet foe has come to pass, as you say. And we've seen this active conjuring of monsters on the margins of our map in a way that serve a certain kind of project here. So I think part of the problem, to come back to what you're saying, is with the way in which Western powers have intervened in these parts of the world for a long time and are fundamentally imbricated in the problems, in the dangers, in the challenges that we're seeing here. Through, as you say, arms sales into zones of conflict. We see that now in the case of Yemen. Or through, for instance, a kind of remote intervention we saw by NATO in Libya, deposing Gaddafi with no plan for the aftermath, which in turn led to a whole escalation of series of events, not just in Libya itself, engulfed in chaos and factionalism, but also across the whole Sahel-Sahara belt of states, which have long been patrons, or sort of dependent on the patronage of Gaddafi. Tuareg Malians from the north of Mali who had been in Libya, coming south into Mali and setting the spark for the rebellion there that then led to the conflict in Mali and so on. And when I was out there in Mali speaking to people, speaking to the military as well in this country, they would point the finger directly at the West and saying that this is down to you that we're facing this problem. And there comes the other side of the equation, which is that interventions that are then put in place have not tended to improve things. Rather, they're imposing this distance that does benefit to some extent the external powers. It keeps the problem out of sight and out of mind for a time. It pushes the problems and risks elsewhere. It dumps them, as it were, in the global borderlands, in the blank spaces, far away from our shores. But at the same time, instability keeps growing, and we see the constant risk of blowback, of larger risks coming back to hit the fortified borders of the West, as it were. And I think we saw that in 2015 in the so-called refugee crisis, for instance, and to some extent in the chaos that's now spreading across the Sahel region.
To what extent is the creation of these sort of like marginal boogeymen, if you will, and both imaginary and real. We've either created them out of whole cloth, or we've created them by destabilizing things, or we've created certain problems. Like I'm thinking in terms of U.S. Intervention in Central and Latin America over the past, 6-7 decades. Which has created instability, which has, in a large part, added to the desire for people to migrate out of those countries and into the U.S. And then, of course, they're demonized for domestic political purposes of a specific, a party or a president. But to what extent is this also being used as a way of like sort of anticipating future problems? Like we're also, maybe not so coincidentally, we're seeing this instability in places which largely are also going to be implicated and are implicated now with climate change. And it's almost as if like, well, we might as well get this party started now. And start to build the walls because, summer is coming, I guess. And we should build the walls now. And the way that we get the walls built is by creating, maybe ginning up a fear because, frankly, there's going to be an even greater crisis down the road.
Yeah. Yeah, just to start off there, I should just clarify that I'm not saying that it's simply a case of creating our own monsters. There are certainly many other actors with a responsibility here in the mix. That includes local actors in some of these countries who have a stake in the game. It includes, of course, the insurgent jihadist groups themselves and so on, criminal networks who all have their own violent means and objectives for doing what they do. So let's also remember that it's a complex mix of factors thrown in here. But we're often, this future projection of a doomsday that we saw already in the 1990s has tended to, in a way, make things worse in the short run and setting us up for a bigger problem in future, I think. Let's just take the example of walling, for instance. When the first walls emerged around western borders, both in the United States and Europe in the 1990s, the migration was taking quite different shapes. It was not nearly as dramatic as what we then started to see. I remember speaking to European border guards who reflected on this era and said, look, until the wall was up, this was in Spain, people just came walking across, and then suddenly we had this situation where now a large number of people just run at this wall all at once, having to be fought back by border guards, and it's really chaotic scenes invoking an emergency. And we saw a similar thing at the US-Mexico border with the so-called kamikaze runs at the same time. So that suddenly we had a crisis, and the crisis was in part created by the very wall that was there supposed to stop the future crisis from happening. And I think there's a risk with that sort of doomsday thinking actually helping to create a doomsday coming into play when we talk about climate-related migration. In academia, we have a much more complex perspective on how climate change is going to impact on future population movements. It's not necessarily the case. We're going to see millions upon millions of people setting out on long journeys towards the west. The evidence is more complex than that. But I think there's a big risk that this gets simplified and turned again into a story of these encroaching dangers that we need to build a wall against. And that, in fact, will then lead to a worsening of the problem.
Do you think from a certain extent, I mean, that may be part of what is driving this policy, broadly, to the extent that there's a policy or these policies that are leading to this sort of dynamic now?
Well, there's a short-sightedness to it, and you hinted at that in terms of the domestic politics here. It's quite easy to rally the vote if you can reassure a certain part of the electorate you're going to build that wall or what have you. And we see that in Europe as well. The most blatant example being perhaps the case of Hungary, where posters were put up to deal with migration and what migrants could and couldn't do in the country, but they were all in Hungarian, which meant any migrants or refugees in the country could not read these posters. It was clearly a message meant for the domestic audience. And right. Similarly, walls, fences, patrols, that kind of measure. The principal purpose of those tends to be to send a domestic political signal rather than halting migration in an absolute sense. In fact, evidence suggests in the United States-Mexico case that the huge investments in border security since the 1990s have led to a larger undocumented population inland in the United States, as people have stayed on over the long term instead of circulating back into right. Mexico as they did in earlier years.
Because they know that they can come back in for seasonal work and then go back home easily. They don't feel the same pressure. In fact, there's the theory right now is that the reason why we are seeing greater numbers of refugee seekers right now is because there is a sense that the door is starting to shut totally, and people need to get there now. So, what? Yes. What is the? I mean, what is there a specific phenomena that's happening around the world that there seems to be a trend in this way, or is it just that one leader looks and sees what another leader is doing and seeing that it may be successful there, or is there a sentiment, or does is this a contagion?
I talk about it in a sense in the book as a form of contagion. When we're seeing this ramping up of fear and threat scenarios and emergencies around borders, often involving quite small numbers. We should recall most immigrants in the United States don't enter, are not the ones who are now being sort of broadcast on television as these major entry. Similarly, in the European case, overland migrants towards Europe, certainly if we take the year 2015 out of the equation, or a relatively small minority of overall migration. But we're seeing here again and again this sort of ramping up of emergency rhetoric that's very easily spread through both social media and traditional media, and that certain politicians as well are very adept at using and are sometimes copying one from the other, from one context to the other. But I think we need to look, and that's part of what I do in the book, look at both the political gains to be had from this and the economic logics underlying it. So on the one hand, there are clear short-sighted political gains from engaging in this sort of emergency politics, rather than taking the longer view and dampening down the rhetoric and trying to find a more humane, sustainable way of approaching these large-scale structural phenomena such as migration, violence, displacement, and so on. But there are also economic gains, and there are gains in terms of how, as I said, core Western powers, interveners, may be able to, through their operations, maybe they are creating a larger problem in the long run, but in the short run they can push the problem somewhere else. They can contain it in border regions on the other side of these divides. So it's, in that sense, quite an efficient way for in a very cynical, short-sighted sense of dealing with it through a politics of risk and fear. And we also see a lot of economic interest coming into that, both on the side of the defense contractors providing the equipment, the border and security agencies and militaries who are engaging in these fights, as well on the other side of the border, the partner regimes who see higher and higher stakes in this, and in fact, time and again can ramp up the rhetoric around emergencies and fears to ask for more favors, as it were, from the Western funders of the operations. And we've seen that across Africa in recent years in terms of migration, for instance.
Is the I guess lastly, is the solution to this? Is it a question of just simply there has to be a different political will? Because it seems like, we've certainly had eras where the execution of policies which would dampen the danger to the extent that it's real, or that would, we've had policies in the past, right? Or have we? I guess is it just a question of political will? Is it a question? How does this? Because it feels like we're in sort of a feedback loop to a certain extent, and so how do we? What is it that takes us out of that feedback loop?
Yeah, it's a bit what I describe in the book as a negative spiral where we keep escalating the sort of emergency in a sense, the sense of fear, the sense of threat and anxiety that keeps worsening the situation and pulling in more and more actors into this way of seeing the world based around security and danger and so on. And certainly, I think part of what we need to do is to go back into history and see this is a pretty recent moment when these fears are being mapped onto the world in this particular way. Certainly when it comes to migration, the post-war years in the United States and Europe saw larger-scale legal circular migration labor programs. They were not perfect, but they were certainly better than the kind of violent, dangerous routes and sense of emergency we've seen at the borders ever since these legal pathways started closing and were replaced by fences and barriers. Similarly, the collaboration with neighboring states, whether it's the case of Mexico, Central America, around human migration and trade, or whether it's a case of Europe and Africa that's now increasingly focused on containing migration at any cost, providing funding for often unchecked security outfits and regimes. That can be framed in a completely different way. And again, not so many years ago, we saw a more positive narrative around modernization, development, economic opportunity that, again, wasn't perfect, but it can certainly be revived. It's still there to some extent. But it can certainly get back and get the upper hand and perhaps be retooled for a new era. And for this to happen, I think part of what needs to go on is a different narrative, a different political narrative, and in a way a remapping of our world, away from these divided maps that we're seeing, where we're projecting all these fears and dangers outside of our territories, and instead trying to assume more of a responsibility for fundamentally structural, systemic challenges. These are not place-bound, people-bound threats that are somehow far away, not belonging to us. We are fundamentally implicated in finding a solution to questions of human mobility, displacement, violence and conflict. And part of that is to do with finding another narrative, a more positive narrative for these collaborations with poorer countries in crisis-hit parts of the world.
No-Go World, How Fear is Redrawing Our Maps and Infecting Our Politics. Ruben Andersson, thanks so much for your time today. We'll put the book, link to the book at majority.fm. Again, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. All right, folks. There you have it. We're going to take a quick break, head into the fun half of the program, wherein we will have fun. We have Nancy Pelosi at the Pete Peterson Foundation today.
Super fun.
Saying those words makes me nauseous. She's always been a big Pete Peterson fan. But the idea that you would go and promote deficit hawkery at this time, really any time, but at this time in particular, is shocking political malpractice. Even if you, I don't know, even if you really thought like your entire objective in government was to close the deficit, it still would be just the dumbest thing in the world to do right now.
Talk about rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
It's not, it's worse than that. It is not rearranging the deck chairs, because at least you'd be rearranging the deck chairs. This is literally like blowing another hole in the Titanic.
Well, Pete Buttigieg was on DeZamiro's Showtime show, and he talked about that thing. And it wasn't a good interview. It was kind of embarrassing for everybody. But he was talking about that thing about where you can say certain things to certain audiences, but then it eventually gets around to everybody.
Right.
And Pelosi thinks like, oh, I'm with Manu Raji at the Pete Peterson Foundation. People that know that this deficit stuff is BS won't ever find out what I'm saying here.
No, I don't think so. I don't think, frankly, I think that's part of the problem. Like, I just don't, I think that she thinks that she doesn't think that there are people who would have that much of a problem with it. Well, we'll get into it in a moment because it is so nuts.
Pete Peterson was a great man. What the hell do you know?
Is that Susan Collins?
Basically. Well, no, it's distorted tape drunk Nancy Pelosi.
Which is Susan
I'm doing
Collins.
it. Which is Susan Collins. Susan.
We're going to take a quick break, head into the fun half. Just a reminder, your support makes this show possible. You can become a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. Also, justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code majority, get 10 juicy % off your coffee, tea, or chocolate. I don't know. I just wanted to.
Okay.
I say the same thing every day. I've said probably the same thing.
Innovation is good.
What show? What number show are we on? Like 2020? Did we even mark our 2000th show?
No, we blew past it, and then like somebody reminded us, and we're like, yeah.
We're not sentimental.
We did the 2019.
When we get to the 10,000th show.
Oh, okay.
You know what's amazing? By the 10,000th show, I feel like China will have like a naval presence like across the Caribbean, and somehow Nancy Pelosi will still be in charge of the Democrats in Congress.
Definitely.
That we need
I will
to
be
cut.
around 100, right? If we did 2,000 shows in the course of, it's been about not quite 8.5 years. So to get 10,000, 40 years total. So 30 years from now, oh no, I'll still be 82. I'll be Nancy Pelosi's age. I will literally be her age.
And you'll be like, Nancy Pelosi was wrong to give that to say at her 130th birthday that we should cut Social Security.
The impression bits are going to be so convoluted by that time.
Oh my God.
When you start adding timelines, Jesus Christ.
Hey, I'm calling on the teleporter line. Listen, my teleporter's really bad, but what do you keep referencing this thing from 40 years ago? How about some new material?
This show will be totally incomprehensible to anyone who's been listening for less than 50 years.
Right, exactly. I'm sorry, you're not part of the 50-year. I was explaining.
Michael's on another meditation
I was explaining
retreat.
to Brendan
He took the helipad
that, like,
to it.
how easily you could lose touch if you were Nancy Pelosi. Where I was saying, like, because so much of your political, I mean, I think it's true with everything to a large extent, for most people, not all people. So much of your knowledge base that you operate on are formed in, formative years for her politically probably happened. I mean, Ryan Grimm was talking about this yesterday, 30, 40 years ago. And she's still operating under those same assumptions and whatnot. And I was trying to use an analogy. It was like, Matt understands that I like, 90s music, the kind of music, and you find like you can extrapolate that to music that exists today. But I'm like, when I'm 80, we have somebody who's Matt's age, is going to be sitting at the board, is going to have no idea about that music.
Pelosi talks about D-Day like I talk about the 72-10 Chicago Bulls.
Right. I mean, it's a little bit way off. It's also really weird.
And you draw the analogy like you're our age too. Same shit.
It is weird to sort of like assess, particularly when you have
Harvey K
kids.
is having a conniption right now.
Like when I look at like my daughter, and I think that like, I can't remember, like the distance between her and Kurt Cobain, my daughter is like twice as large as it was for me at her age between me and the Beatles. And I'm like, what? Because the Beatles seemed like forever ago when I was 14. And, the idea that Kurt Cobain is twice the distance from my daughter at age 14 than the Beatles were for me at age 14 is pretty stunning.
Time.
I mean, even for like us, like you were like an adult when he committed suicide.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's wild.
There are people being born today who are younger than anyone ever before.
Yes.
Dude.
Think about it. It's like my daughter doesn't even know who Kurt Cobain is. And I was reading an actuarial report. And I was getting really high. And
I will say, like,
my daughter doesn't know who
was
Kurt Cobain
when
is.
I was 10,
that means the Foo Fighters won't even be remembered.
but when I was 10, the distance between World War II and was 30 years earlier, and we've almost doubled that time since then. Like, and I can tell you, World War II seemed like a long time ago when I was 10, and
like Iran-Contra.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what? I got hope for Generation Z. I gotta say, they're a lot more. I mean, they scare me a little bit in some ways. They're just like feral children of the internet, but a lot of them are really into Marx, and I think they might save us.
Well, hope springs eternal.
Yeah.
Speaking of Generation Z, tonight's Tuesday. What's up, Michael?
Wow.
I'm
Wait, is it
tired.
because you're contemplating your mortality that you were so?
I'm tired.
Yeah. Okay, I get it. Go. Just drift off. Tonight, before the main show, we're doing a live stream with Kyle Kalinske, and we're going to be talking about some of the new this progressive economic pledge. Kyle also has requested he would like to do a little bit of Dave Rubin dunking with me, which seems to be a thing that people like to get in on. And then we're going to debate a little bit of what is the difference between a socialist internationalism versus left-wing isolationism. And we're not going to make that about we're going to try to get out of the granular and out of the candidate sort of bickering and actually see if there is like a philosophical and positional difference there that's useful to think about. Then in the main show, Glenn Greenwald's going to come on about this massive Lava Jato story, and then Bhaskar Sunkara and Ben Burgess are both going to be in studio, and we're going to talk about the German SDP, the history of socialism, and what models might actually be relevant to the United States in 2019 for greater freedom and democracy in our economy. Patreon.com/TMBS. Michael Brooks Show on YouTube, where we're getting close to our first 50,000 subscribers on YouTube. So hit subscribe.
Jamie.
Out now, or actually, I'm sorry, I fucked that up. Out tomorrow on the Antifada, we have on Ben Burgess. He was great on the Majority Report. He's great on TMBS. Spoiler alert, he's also great on the Antifada.
He had a great time. He texted me.
Oh, that's so nice. Yeah, we talk all about logic and why the left needs it. And, you know, we put our little Antifada spin on it so it won't be boring to people who've already seen him on these shows. That's out tomorrow. Check it out, folks.
Yeah, Literary Hangover. Check out the patrons are enjoying the Orweller series that I've been doing. Check that out. And Margaret Fuller, I'll get that episode up on YouTube soon. Also, if we have any electronic music composers that do sort of instrumental electronic music, think like Keter Livaninsky or Aphex Twin or like Caribou or something like that, get in touch with me at Mattlech on Twitter, MATTLECH, because I have project that I might be interested in. So we'll update you as that develops.
Quick break. Fun half. Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous, you're a little bit upset, you're riled up.
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude, you want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
Some good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457-2-38-56-27. 1/2. 5 8s. 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy.
Dance, dance, dance.
Rand Paul.
I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey Sam, hey Andy, you guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
That guy might be a Nazi.
Agree.
No.
Death to America.
Do.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook.
Throw our hands up.
Ooh. Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me,
Hey! Shut up!
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.
We are back. It's the fun half, ladies and gentlemen. It is the fun half. So much fun. Too much fun. Let's play this clip, Nancy Pelosi. I want to be... No, I don't really necessarily want to be generous. But I mean, I just want to be fair insofar as that I could see an argument why one wouldn't impeach. I can see various ones, but I can see the validity of an argument that says, like, oh, this is going to hurt the reelection chances of members of my caucus in purple states, and that's why I'm not going to do it. That argument, though, needs to be backed up, particularly if you're the Speaker of the House, with an actual plan to do something in between now and the election. Because if you leave a vacuum for someone like Donald Trump, he will fill it. If you leave a vacuum for someone like Bill Barr, he will fill it. And they will fill it with their own investigations, and they will fill it with their own Republicans who go out who are completely shameless in pursuing these things. And the only plan that I could see there, I don't know what it would be. Maybe another sort of like a type of investigations, or my understanding is they've passed all the bills that they had really basically set up. They've passed a bunch of them. It hasn't particularly worked. I mean, there's a bunch of votes that they've taken, but those votes aren't going to go away. If you need votes to run on, they have them. The idea that you would be in any way contemplating at this moment what Nancy Pelosi is expressing at the Pete Peterson Foundation. Pete Peterson was Nixon's Commerce Secretary, billionaire from, I think it was BlackRock Investments or something like that. He recently died. Nancy Pelosi was very praiseful upon his death. They are basically looking to raid Social Security and Medicare long term. And they do it through deficit hawkery. And they have purchased, there are so many of these summits and so many Pete Peterson Foundation grants and whatnot that it's very hard to find journalists, particularly over a certain age, who have not been in some way funded in some endeavor or another by Pete Peterson. They all haven't been corrupted by it necessarily, but it certainly dominated the discourse. This is stunning. She's at a fiscal summit 2019, Building America's Future, being interviewed by Madhu Raju.
Before we get into the issues of the conference, I do want to talk about some of the issues that have been in the news over the past week. You were traveling abroad, and you were in Normandy. The president was in Normandy, too, and he made some comments about you. He was sitting in the American cemetery in Normandy, and probably the most aggressive remarks I've heard from a president make about a Speaker of the House. He said that you were nervous. He called you a disaster. He also called you a nasty, vindictive, horrible person. This is not me. This is the president saying this. He later went on to tweet that you were a disgrace to yourself and your family. So, I mean, how do you react to the president of the United States calling you, the Speaker of the House, insulting you like that?
Well, what bothers me more is that we're talking about that instead of how to reduce the national debt. Let's just say this. We were...
Now, look, I can understand the idea to make it look like you're talking about business. And if you don't want to talk about him, say, well, he's a bit of a child. Let's move on to something else. But does she understand that in success, what she's setting up with this, there are a million other things, a million other places she could have been yesterday or today, rather, to do that same pivot. He's a child. I don't want to talk about him. I want to talk about infrastructure. He's a child. I don't want to talk about him. I want to talk about monopolies in our healthcare industry. I want to talk about monopolies in our tech industry. I want to talk about healthcare for Americans. I want to talk about what's happening in terms of a woman's right to choose. I want to talk about the judiciary. I want to talk about getting wage growth up after a month where wage growth was stagnant and jobs fell. I want to talk about dealing with wealth inequality. I want to talk about dealing with women's health issues. I want to talk about the opioid crisis. There are a million things that she could have brought up in that instance. I want to talk about what's going on with the destabilization in the Middle East. I want to talk about what's happening with the Dreamers. I want to talk about what's happening where we're trying to leverage our trade to force Mexico to have draconian policies towards people who are escaping violence. A million things she could have talked about. And she's choosing to talk about the one thing that in the event her strategy works and gets more Democrats elected, that they will be faced with having to impose austerity policies because she has already laid the premise that the real problem we have is a debt crisis. It is beyond unconscionable. It's unconscionable from a policy standpoint because we have no more of a debt. We don't have a debt crisis. And it's unconscionable from a political standpoint because everybody who pays an ounce of attention to this has seen what the Republicans do. They have done this since the Reagan era. They drive up the deficits and the debt. When Democrats get into office, they force Democrats to cut and to build towards a surplus. And then when the Democrats are out of power, they drive up the deficit and the debt. Rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. Specifically, how many times we went from Republican to Democrat to Republican to Democrat to Republican to Democrat and did those same things. And we now know that all of the supposed literature and academic research that suggested that we were in a debt crisis was BS, like literally a spreadsheet that hadn't been double checked. Reinhardt and Rogoff.
Identified by a grad student at UMass. Just to underline how radical a mistake that was.
Yes, and everybody had adopted it. And you know, Pete Peterson had enshrined these guys. I don't even know if they can walk.
What was the book called? I used to remember.
I don't
remember either.
There you have it.
I just would like to add briefly. I mean, I think that this is where, and I was reading Bhaskara's book in preparation. He does a good job of explaining like the elements of understanding the third way globally, going back to the 80s and 90s, and how, you know, it does fit in with what even that Nancy Pelosi sound. And in some ways, there's like the personal failings of politicians, there's the fact that they're all compromised by corporate campaign contributions, and then there is the balancing act between basically having a political conflict between one party that's there to purely indulge capital interests. They have absolutely nothing else to do, which are the Republicans, obviously. And then a Democratic Party that sort of like has to triangulate between preserving remnants and then helping facilitate the next rounds of basically austerity. And, you know, there was definitely in the 80s and 90s structural reasons for that. And so it's like a question of escaping that ideologically and in terms of your donor base, but also hopefully reconfiguring how people understand the economy as well.
Let's take a call here. Let's see. Got a lot of people who got on right at the beginning. Calling from a 210 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Good afternoon, Sam. It's John from San Antonio.
John from San Antonio. Are you calling about the Iowa poll, John?
Actually, I am. Yeah, on Saturday night, Iowa's top pollster, Ann Seltzer, released her latest poll. It had Bernie in second place at 16%, Warren at 15%, Buttigieg at 14%. This increased the focus on who's going to get the left
And
vote.
Biden at 24, right?
Yeah, he's there. Bernie supporters.
It's okay, John. It's not that bad.
Yeah, I hope.
Well,
not.
let's put it in context.
Bernie supporters.
Let's put this in context for a second. There was another poll, I believe the last one was in March, correct? Biden's down.
Right, that's right.
4 or 5 points. Bernie's down about 8 points. Warren is up by 4, 5, or 6, and Buttigieg is up by about 12 or 13.
Yeah, that's more or less right.
Okay.
Okay, so the increased focus on who's going to get the left vote. The Bernie supporters seem split on how they as activists and how Bernie himself should deal with Warren. Now, pointing out policy differences, yet being civil in critiques is my preferred method of distinguishing candidates. To me, Bernie is far superior in reining in military intervention and spending. His commitment to core issues from 2016, campaign and Medicare for All, $15 an hour minimum wage, free college, and combating climate change are still some of the top priorities for the country. Bernie will be giving a speech tomorrow on how democratic socialism is the only way to defeat oligarchy and authoritarianism. He's going to be relating this to the FDR's For Freedom speech from 1941. Warren made a smart move when she decided to put out 19 policy proposals, starting with the wealth tax on January 24th, and the last 2 policies were the economic patriotism and green manufacturing. In just recently, I doubt that Bernie will criticize Warren because he has too much respect for her. He called her his favorite senator, invited her to his Inequality in America town hall in March of 2018. If Bernie does win the nomination, Warren will very likely be his top pick for vice president. I know that some people may scoff at this idea as being conspiratorial, but do you think that if they formed a pack, or maybe it's already formed, not to criticize each other and to release their delegates to the candidate who has the best chance of winning the nomination, this will increase the odds that one of them will win the nomination? What do you think of this idea, and how would you analyze the Sanders-Warren relationship as it relates to the nomination right now?
I mean, I think it would have been political malpractice for either one of them to make that type of pact. In terms of like the delegates, I think both of them, and I don't know that they needed to make a pact to not attack each other. I just don't think that they're going to do that. I am not convinced that they are. I think I think it's a little bit counterintuitive, but I'm not convinced that they're necessarily going after the same voters. Like I don't think that the question is between Bernie and Warren really is that there are many voters who are saying who has better policies. I think if you're with Bernie or with Warren, you're not there because you think one has better policies per se than the other. Particularly if you're with Warren, I think it's just really more. I think there are other factors. I think Warren has now set herself up as someone who is like who's by generating these plans has set herself up, and in the way that she has sort of doled them out and sort of branded herself is as sort of a workhorse in some way. I don't think it's a competition of plans. I really think actually where Bernie's votes lie are with Biden and with Buttigieg. And if I were Bernie, I would, at this point, I think it's smart for him to pivot to beating Trump in the general election. I think Buttigieg is going to have problems after the debates in some way, because I think he's not as rooted as these guys. But I think it's really just mine Biden for more votes. At this point, that's what I would be doing. If I was Bernie, I would be going after Biden's votes right now, because if you are voting, you got to remember, right? Like, we see this on the plane of policy and ideology, but there are a lot of other voters out there who don't see it that way. They see it. There's other planes in which they see it. They could see it as anti-establishment on some level, which isn't the same thing, because Buttigieg then sort of seems like a little bit like he's coming out of nowhere. He's outside of the system. That's what Beto supposedly had some of that, and Buttigieg sort of stole that from Beto. Or you could just see it as like, I feel safe with an old white guy. I think, some people, that's got to be part of Biden's support. Part of Biden's support is also the idea that he can win. So I think Bernie goes after those. I think to try and get into an argument that his policies are fundamentally better than Warren's, I think is like you're fishing in the wrong pond at that point.
Can I just add two quick things? The part I totally agree with Sam on, and I'll just make a plug again that I think is the intersection of making the case that Bernie is stronger against Trump than Biden, and will relate to people in key areas, is hammering the hell out of him on trade. And I think that is grounded and relevant enough for people that isn't a particularly abstract policy area. I think that that's a very lived and breathed thing for people that exemplify that, Biden might have a glass jaw when it comes down to it, particularly his sort of brand as a blue collar guy.
Absolutely.
And I think that I agree that it isn't about, partially just because clearly that's not even what Bernie wants to do, and I don't think Sanders and I agree that they're swimming in different ponds to some extent. But I do think that if you're a Sanders supporter, and obviously I am, it's going to start to be increasingly important, particularly in much more narrow areas of conversation, but parts that John's obviously part of because he's an important part of this show as an example. I think there are some people who actually do care about our footprint in the world, and there's a huge difference there that matters to millions of people's lives.
Huge.
And then the second is, I think at some point, we're going to have to really sit back and say, okay, it's very nice, but everybody can get a bunch of smart people in a room and come up with plans. How you actually win political battles is basically a very different thing, and those are a fundamental different approach to politics. So I think as supporters and as surrogates, those are important.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. It doesn't matter how detailed and how good your policy proposals are if you can't get them passed, right? And Bernie is a movement candidate who understands that in order to get any of this stuff passed, you need a real grassroots movement, you need labor, and you need to sustain it through way past the election and build an infrastructure for that. And I think he's the only one who really understands that. So for the people who do care about not just what the policy is, but getting the policies through, that's something that he could probably harp on.
Definitely.
I think there's some value to that. I still, I think you want to fish where there's the most fish. And I think the argument, which I think is probably largely true, although I think it's not a slam dunk argument to make, because Elizabeth Warren can also point to I created the most durable agency perhaps in the history of the United States.
Yeah, but then it flips back to, how broad is as that sort of
I don't think it's broad at all, but I'm just saying
argument.
Isn't it being dismantled by the Trump administration?
No,
right
they
now?
can't.
Oh, okay.
They've tried.
She's a very smart bureaucratic player, and she would make a great Treasury Secretary.
But the point is that I think all of that is small bore. That is exactly my point. And I think I think there's a lot more. I think the trade stuff makes a lot of sense because it goes right at Biden. But that's my point, is you go where the fish are, and the fish are all in Biden's pond right now, because all Bernie needs to do is take 10 percentage points of Biden's away. And then it creates a cascading effect.
90-10 rule. And really my recommendations, because I do think they're relevant, but I think the critique I outlined is one that he shouldn't even be making. It should be people like me, and it talks to a fraction of the vote. I think the vast majority.
Foreign policy?
And an argument about, yes, foreign policy, but also more broadly military spending. I mean, I do think, ultimately there is going to be some conflict at some point between never-ending imperial engagement and having the types of reforms we want in our own society. Not to mention, I do have to say, I'm going to hope that at least 2% of people, and particularly people that fancy themselves as informed and care about issues, will in fact care about the fact that we impact every single life on this planet. Is something that can't just be shoved,
I'm
sort
convinced
of put to the
at least
side.
0.75% of the electorate votes.
Great. If that 0.75 is an Iowa caucus goer that, turns up in a marginal way, that's great. And
they're
again,
already with Bernie.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
but they're already with Bernie.
No, not necessarily. I mean, this is another reason, frankly, I'll just say it strategically. I mean, this is another reason, why do you think I did so much content on Tulsi Gabbard early? I never think, and this will piss a lot of people off, I'll always give her credit where credit is due, but I never thought she's more than a 2-3% candidate tops. But I know where that 2-3% is likely coming from. So I wanted to make pretty clear that I don't even necessarily buy the idea that she is more of the
what is she
peace
getting?
candidate.
She's
at 1 or 2%.
Yeah, ideologically motivated left liberals who consider themselves progressives might not be as large a group as people who vote based on personality or whatever, but they are an extremely engaged group, and they do attend things like caucuses.
Right.
And they're shaping narrative.
I agree.
And I think that's another thing that I don't accept either.
Apparently,
Bernie's...
no one said in that poll Bill de Blasio.
Aw.
He didn't just get
got a policy argument.
He didn't just get 0%. He got 0.
Wouldn't it be really funny if Bill de Blasio, though, really went in? He was just building off of what I have for New York, it's a national plan where you just cut deals with real estate developers and then you do some good things here and there.
John, thanks for the call.
All right. Thank you, Sam.
He literally got, I think there was one that came out in New Hampshire, and I feel like it was actually Seth Moulton. Somebody else got a 0.0 in one of these
There's
polls.
one other person, yeah. Calling from a 608 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hi, it's Will calling from West Virginia.
Will from West Virginia. What's on your mind?
Yeah, so my question is for everyone, and I definitely want to hear what Michael and Jamie have to say about this. I think if you're on the left and interested in history, it can be pretty demoralizing to look at all the past failures of our movements. I'm thinking about things like the decline of the labor movement, social democratic or labor parties turning neoliberal, or the pink tide fizzling out. So my question is, how do we learn about these things and take lessons from them without falling into demoralization and depression? And I'll take my answer off the air.
Well, can I just answer before the two people that he wanted to hear answer? I would say that you cannot over-extrapolate certain historical case studies to be sort of eternal truths about how these things go, because the economic environment, the media environment, all these sorts of things change. So I don't get that from history at all. I find history and people struggling for social and economic justice throughout history as very inspiring. So I think you just got to reframe it that way.
I agree, and I would just add that, and I am not saying things aren't very bleak, but you can just as easily, if you had a reactionary perspective, you could say, man, there keeps being these countervailing forces and breakthroughs, and we think we have them crushed and have all the power on our side, but then they come into power and they do these things. So to some extent, you have to just adopt a broader frame and, not be Pollyanna-ish, but cynicism is its own form of inverse Pollyanna. It's all true.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot listening to our own series, History is a Weapon, because Sean and Matt Chrisman, they just know too much, and it has made them a little bit cynical. I think Sean has kind of ramped down his activism, at least partly as a result of how much he knows. And also he's just getting old and tired. But I don't know. I think it's actually kind of optimistic in some ways to look at the grand sweep of history because, yes, we've had some past failures and those are depressing, but it just means we have more data for the next time that we have a new cycle of struggle, a new cycle of anti-capitalist struggle, and we can retailor our approach to shifting conditions of today. Like, I don't think you should trust anyone who says, okay, there's a revolution, it's going to happen, you just have to listen to me and do A, B, and C. Like, no, that's ridiculous. Nobody could possibly know that. But looking at the grand sweep of history, like Sean got into some world systems theory on the last episode, some Origi. No mode of production has ever lasted forever. That includes, the one that came before capitalism, feudalism.
So that was a first.
And the shift from feudalism to capitalism took hundreds of years, right? Which is about as long as capitalism itself has existed. And there were a ton of false starts. So if you look at it that way, we're really just getting started. And I think that we should have some hope.
Hayes talked about this dynamic just a little bit on that thing that we put out. What was it? Well, I can't remember what day we did. A couple of weeks ago. Maybe it was just for members, or did we put it out? I think it was just for members. But he cited the German Democratic Socialist, I can't remember his name, who told that proverb about the peasant farmer was dying, and he wanted to make sure that he was taking care of his sons, but he had nothing. So he told them that he had buried a bag of gold in the fields. And the sons went and tilled the field, turned up the field, looking for that gold. They never found the gold, but what they did do is they turned the soil enough so that it ended up being bumper crop time. And they ended up all getting fed.
That's
Even
really
if you don't
lovely.
make it to the Olympics, if you train for it, you'll be in great
It's
shape.
like, it kind of reminds me, two more things. There's like a very
no
poetic
social
metaphor that Sean put forth on one of our episodes where like he compared building communism to like building a cathedral. Like, right, medieval peasants or the workers would build a cathedral and you probably would never get to see it completed. But, you'd work your whole life knowing that it was in service of something great, something greater than yourself.
In other words, so they would go on to have problems with kids and, sorry.
Yeah, maybe your kids could see
I'm
the
talking
cathedral.
about the cathedral.
There's
No,
that
okay.
George Sand quote that says, "Our revenge will be the laughter of our children," too, which is very optimistic and
Very
maybe a bit Pollyannish.
I mean, it's sort of like the reason you have to become a patron of all of our shows. It's a cathedral.
Totally.
Well, it's also
Build the cathedral.
It's also
Start
why people
today.
plant trees, right? I mean, it's the trees.
Totally. Oh, and one more thing. I'm sorry. Just like the idea that we were living at the end of history, right, in the 90s, that was so much more depressing in a way than what we have right now, as leftists at least, because like really the 90s were good in some ways, but like I wouldn't want to live in a world where I thought that was going to continue forever. And now the neoliberal consensus is clearly breaking down and it's terrifying and we don't know what's going to come after it. But we know that history has definitely not ended.
The market was just on fire, though, in the late 90s.
The 90s was so fun. Francis Fukuyama, my sitcoms.
Call him from a 610 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hello, Sam. Mike from Pennsylvania.
Mike from Pennsylvania. How are you, sir?
I am outstanding. So
do tell.
I sat down with a fellow show regular, Fry Comrade, and we spoke to Shahid Buttar, who is primarying Nancy Pelosi in her district in San Francisco in the upcoming year, and discussed a lot of the issues and why it's so necessary for him to do as well as possible, because she lives in the bluest district in the country and she's going to Pete Peterson events.
Oh, I know it. You should have heard me at the beginning of you should have, like, when when Brendan was, I was like, where is she doing that? At the Pete Peterson? And I was just like, you gotta be.
He's one of the prime villains of this whole show universe. I don't want to overindulge like this sympathy that I have for Harry Reid. I mean, obviously we're light years apart on politics, but having Schumer and Pelosi there, and Schumer, of course, and Pelosi both with Silicon Valley and Wall Street are going to be compromised because of their geography, but on the level of like blue state representation and still bending over backwards for this stuff when you had a guy, representing an actual battleground state who really, at least on core things like New Deal policies, was, mostly willing to fight. That adds to at least how annoyed I am.
Well, one of the things that's interesting is like people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, because they're so far from actually running in competitive elections, they don't have to engage with what really plays. They can do the mental gymnastics of just saying like, oh, well, this will get us more money and that'll help us run more campaigns. We'll fund more campaigns. So they do whatever gets them more money and gets them more power, because if you help steer funds towards a candidate, they feel obligated to vote for you in leadership, et cetera. And so it creates this feedback loop where they're continually picking political things that are not popular amongst the voters, but which get them more personal power, which is why it's so vital that you have AOCs and people like Shahid who are primarying them and forcing them to face electoral realities in their district. And I can tell you, if you look at the voters of San Francisco, even now with all the Silicon Valley rot, they are not in favor of Pete Peterson cutting Social Security and getting rid of these programs and having balanced budgets. That's insane. And Shahid is not just some sort of like weird kook. He's been on the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is one of the major civil liberties organizations online, leading the fight for net neutrality. He is an activist, but he's also an accomplished lawyer. He's been on the front lines. For example, I think he helped found Muslims for Ferguson. So this is somebody who has true blue cred. And really, our discussion was really interesting, covering so many range of issues. We talked about Robert Mueller and his past fighting with, creating all those entrapment schemes for Muslims around the country, the surveillance of mosques that happened to my local mosque, even though they have absolutely no extremist rhetoric at all. It's insane. And how, liberals like Nancy Pelosi depended on someone who was a right-wing Republican to do something against the Republican Party, and how it fails even the most basic logic test. So,
Hi, Sam. This is John from San Antonio. I'm calling. Shahid Buttar is an attorney running against Nancy Pelosi in her House district, the most blue in America. He's a great candidate, and I'm highly concerned that a loser and poser named Mike from Pennsylvania is calling in on his behalf. My concern is that his weak-kneed surrogacy will undermine Shahid's efforts, and I'd just like to know what you think about that.
Mike, we'll put a link to the podcast in our podcast description today. Do we have a link? We'll find it.
Send me a link, guys, and
I'll
I'll
make
message
sure
it
to
to
send
Jamie.
that over to you. But if you're listening, the easiest way to find it is just to search Into Deep Patreon. So there you go.
All right, Mike from PA.
Really interesting. Thanks, guys.
Bye. All right, let's take one more quick phone call. Get some more sound. Calling from a 703 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hi, this is Claire from Virginia.
Claire from Virginia. How are you, Claire?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. What's on your mind?
So I was calling to remind everyone in Virginia that today is primary day, and we have a lot of great progressives running and primarying against a lot of really bad Democrats, including my district, Barbara Favola, who takes a ton of money from Dominion and actually promised to no longer take money from Dominion, and then like 2 weeks later it came out that she was still taking money. So just wanted to remind everyone to vote.
That's unbelievable.
That's a great call.
That's a great clean lie right there.
Oh, okay.
Sure,
yeah,
I won't do it.
She's really horrible.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say I wouldn't take money?
I misheard.
Oh, okay. I would. Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I meant to say I would take money. That's what I meant to say. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Well, get out and vote.
Yeah. So
folks.
The person primarying her is Nicole Merlin, and she's a great young progressive Democrat. And so I really recommend everyone go look up what their primary is going on right now, because it's really important. We're so close to turning Virginia blue, so really excited about that.
Yep. All right. Good luck with it, Claire. Appreciate the call.
I feel like with
Thank you so much.
With the state of local news, you could just get away if you're at like that level. You could just get away with lies like that all the time.
Well, you know
while.
what? Guess what? You can also do that on a national level, apparently. I mean, that's basically what
local.
we're, learning to a large extent, right? I mean, that dude in the district with all the Sinclair media got away with body slamming and a journalist, and there was
Gianforte.
Barely any coverage.
Yeah, you mean like the state of Montana? Isn't he the only rep from Montana? I think they only, so that's the entire state.
This is a little bit strange. This Tom Homan. Oh, yeah. I haven't quite figured out exactly what the heck is going on here. So he's calling it a bluff, right? And it was Trump. The bluff was to the American public. Right? Like, I'm going to threaten Mexico with tariffs. Then they're going to come to the White House and we're going to basically pretend that we're negotiating a new deal, even though the deal that we're making is one that they already agreed to a month and a half ago or 2 months.
Taking credit for things that are going to happen already is A+ move.
Totally. People do that in politics. I've heard a couple of stories that I don't know them for sure, but I've heard a couple of stories. But, I mean, everybody understands the dynamic here, right? It's like basically like, I'm going to meet with Matt after the show today, and I'm going to tell him in no uncertain terms, tomorrow better be Wednesday. Because if it's not, there's going to be hell to pay around here. And then we meet. Matt comes out, says, tomorrow, I agree, Wednesday. It will be Wednesday. And there it is, folks.
That's what I thought.
And here is this guy, the former, was he the former ICE director or the former acting ICE director? Former ICE director, Tom Homan.
If it wasn't for the tariff threat, they wouldn't be taking aliens off the train. They wouldn't be sending troops to the southern border. They wouldn't be expanding the migrant protection protocol. They wouldn't be talking about a safe third country agreement. Mm-hmm. The tariffs worked. His bluff worked. So I think once again he showed
people on
Capitol Hill that he's smarter than them. Pardon me?
You said his bluff worked. Was it really bluff, or you think he was willing to do it?
No, I think it was a threat. I didn't use the word bluff. I think it was a threat, and I think he would have followed through. And I'll tell you something else. Mm-hmm. If they don't follow through on this agreement, he will impose tariffs.
Wait a second. That is like, oh, shoot, maybe Trump is watching. He never wants to be exposed as if he was bluffing.
Oh, you think I'm bluffing?
Oh, you think I'm bluffing? Let's just go back. Let's just watch this. It's pretty amazing. And I love the look on the face of Trish Reagan, she's the journalist over there, right, at Fox Business. You just said bluff. She couldn't bring herself to say that. Go ahead.
Protection protocol. They wouldn't be talking about a safe third country agreement. Mm-hmm. The tariffs worked. His bluff worked. So I think once again he showed.
What else could he have said there? His bluff work. It sounded like to me. Could he have been saying his blov?
Like the it's hard for him to say tariffs, and when he says tariff threat, it sounds like he says terrorist threat.
Right.
But bluff is fairly.
Yeah, go back just one more time. Let's just hear it just one more time, just to make sure that we're getting it.
A safe third country agreement. Mm-hmm. The tariffs worked. His bluff worked. So I think once again he showed
Was it really bluff,
people on
though?
Capitol Hill
Was it
that he's
bluff?
smarter than them. Pardon me?
You said his bluff worked. Was it really bluff, or you think he was willing to do it?
No, I think it was a threat. I didn't use the word bluff. I think it was a threat, and I think he would have followed through. And I'll tell you something else. If they don't follow through on this agreement, he will impose tariffs.
I love the idea that he sort of like drifts off and he's doing the calculation in his head like, oh, no, wait, yeah, no, Donald Trump's not going to be happy with that. Yeah, no, I didn't use the word bluff.
Just usually have to wait for your intern to cut the video for you, dude.
Well, that's the point. Yeah,
that
exactly.
was like Jesus Christ.
I think Chris Hayes made this point on Twitter, which is that if the tariffs are as great as Trump made them sound, why did we trade them for just a few hundred more police officers in Chiapas?
Right. Because
right, like the tariffs are supposed to save us.
It's supposed to be so good for the economy,
We
but
just traded away.
guess what, guys? We got 1,000 cops in southern Mexico instead.
There you
Can I
go.
also just say that if that B-roll footage scares you, you have issues. I mean,
Seriously.
Jesus Christ. Like, this is what's so terrifying? Some people on the top of some flatbed trucks
Well,
looking
you never
for
know.
asylum.
Coming
You're
for
out of your
your
minds.
summer home in upstate Minnesota.
Hey, man, no, I don't want to stay in Minneapolis.
It's like
I want to go deeper
Minnetonka.
into the state. Oh, yeah. You didn't support Trump's tariffs. Now I have your house.
Now, listen. When it came out, when there was a story yesterday that the New York Times reported that Donald Trump made a deal that had already been made and his no bluff worked, Donald Trump had to make up that there was a special part of the deal that nobody knew about. And he's still got to go on with that special part of the deal that nobody knew about. Here he is, clip number 4, saying that, yeah, I know Mexico is saying that there is no special part of the deal, but there is a special part of the deal, and I'll tell you in about 2 weeks.
That's why it's a secret.
Yep.
Mexico's foreign minister says there was no secret agreement beyond what was announced on Friday. What do you mean in your tweet?
Well, we have an agreement on something that they will announce very soon. It's all done. And they have to get approval, and they will get approval. If they don't get approval, we'll have to think in terms of tariffs or whatever, but it's just another aspect of what we've done. It was all done because of the tariffs and because of the relationship that we have with Mexico. I spoke with the president yesterday. And by the way, I was with the president of France the other day, too. And he's a great guy, Emmanuel. He's a great guy. So we had a great conversation the other day. And I think you're going to see some real action. Sad that when you think of it, Mexico is doing more for the United States as of now than Congress and then specifically the Democrats. They have to get their act together. They have to work and get something done because you get a tremendous problem at the border. You have people pouring in, and it means crime, it means drugs, it means so many other things. We're building the wall. We're going to have close to 500 miles of wall built by the end of next year. That's a lot, and we're moving along very rapidly. We won the big court case, as you know, the other day, and that was a big victory for us. So a lot of good things are happening, but I want to thank Mexico, and we do have one other thing that will be announced at the appropriate time, but they have to get approval from their legislative body. What is it?
Why are the Mexicans denying it then?
I don't think they'll be denying it very long. It's all done.
It's a secret thing that they don't want to tell any of the legislators about.
Yeah, that's
that
part
they
of it.
want to pass, but they'll be doing it soon. It's one of those things. It's just
He is such a little baby.
I'm reading a review of Michael Wolff's new book, Siege, or Under Siege on Trump. And when it comes to Trump, I'm totally pro Michael Wolff and totally support gossip and totally support all of his journalistic methods. And apparently this new book is just even more unflattering than the last one, if that was possible. And this reviewer says, at this point, the book's genre switches to sci-fi. What if this quote-unquote strange organism, speaking of Trump, with its uncanny ability to survive every threat, is some kind of unkillable force, like the alien in Alien, wounded multiple times. Trump has never quote-unquote bled out. Even Bannon believes in his quote-unquote magical properties. And then skipping ahead, that whatever the scenario, a new bankruptcy, an ultimatum dolefully given by Ivanka, or charges, Bannon predicts, whatever the scenario, Trump won't go out classy.
Well, that's what Trump said the other day about Nixon. He goes, they're talking about Nixon left. I'm not going to leave.
It's weak.
So, we live in this very strange world where we have a mad king who is running the country, and 50%, not quite 50%, but 40 some odd percent that control, and at least in the Senate, more than 50% of the seats, pretend like he's not insane. And there are moments like this one. The Mexico has a secret provision to the deal that we made that really validates the whole deal I made, that they're not telling anybody about. They're denying it, of course, but they're not going to deny it for long because it's true, because they got to get passed by their legislature. They keep asking this question because they can know that he's lying and everybody just wants to watch him squirm. And they even ask it of Sarah Sanders, even at friendly venues, but she knows. She doesn't have to give a real answer. Here is Fox and Friends asking White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders, what's this whole secret part of the deal?
On this, the deal, there's more troops at the border. We know there's going to be money to give these would-be illegals that are trying for asylum in our country some type of a job opportunity. They're supposed to get health care. They're supposed to get shelter in Mexico. I get it. Now, there's some talk about this third.
Now, the idea, just a day ago, this guy was railing on the fact that immigrant children who have been living in this country are going to get health care or get a chance to go get schooling or get to play baseball as some type of massive injustice. But the idea that we would threaten another country to provide that stuff for the same people, that's just a good deal. It's unbelievable how there's no semblance of shame or just recognition as those words are coming. Oh, I remember yesterday I was complaining this was horribly offensive, but whatever, I digress.
Illegals that are trying for asylum in our country some type of a job opportunity. They're supposed to get health care. They're supposed to get shelter in Mexico. I get it. Now, there's some talk about this third country deal that could be in the works that Mexico has to pass through their legislature, and that the president indicated it's there. Nobody else says it's really there. Can you tell us what other side deal could be coming our way?
Look, I'm not going to get ahead of President Trump or the president of Mexico in making further announcements, but we have had discussions, and you can see even in the joint statement that they released where they said that within the next 90 days further action could be announced and that we will continue those discussions. That's exactly what we're doing. That's exactly what we're talking about. And we've already got agreements on the way for other action that will help, again, solidify Mexico's commitment to stop illegal immigrants from coming across our southern border.
Okay.
I have a question. In the Bush,
we're going to send them all back to Africa.
Public enemy. In the Bush administration, would they have felt in the Bush era, would they have felt the need, if Kilmeade was doing the same equivalent of that reversal within 24 hours, would he have felt the need, or someone like him felt the need to say, no, I know that may sound different from yesterday, but here's some BS to paper it over? Is part of that extremism a product of Trump just normalizing lying to a new extent?
I think that's part of it, but I also think part of it is like under the Bush administration, they were much more adept at this stuff.
More
like
disciplined.
It wasn't just, George Bush wasn't just like making up stuff in the moment. They would have meetings and they would fashion a lie. And then they would all be on the same page, and they would all know how they were going to present the lie, and then they would tell the lie. And they had people like were in charge of this.
It wasn't like, I heard Maureen Dowd drinks. She's a total loser.
They had artisanal lies as opposed to mass-produced lies.
I forget who said this, but like Bush was their idiot and Trump is his own idiot.
Yes, I think that's true. And I would say that short of Bill Barr, everyone around him are pretty much idiots as well.
In the new Wolf book, apparently, Trump is also really upset that Barron is having a growth spurt. I should be laughing at this. Because he's going to be taller than him soon.
Oh, my God.
Barron's salad days.
I
are
feel
over.
seriously. If there is anybody,
He's
you know,
on
people are
notice.
constantly looking for people to sympathize with in the Trump world, which has never made any sense to me. If you're an adult, that's on you. But yeah, it's tons of solidarity with Barron Trump. Jesus Christ.
Until it all takes hold. And
Yeah,
it
until he's
becomes an
20.
actual adult Trump.
Barron on Twitch.
Here is the right-wing talk show host, Tammy Bruce, who is really, really upset that undocumented immigrants between the ages of 18 to 25 will be receiving health care as part of California's Medicaid program. This same program is also going to be, or at least in the same bill, is going to be expanding subsidies for people who are middle class, upper middle class, will be getting subsidies for their health insurance. It's not subsidized enough, should be full subsidy, but we're getting there. But she is just outraged at the idea that we would be giving health care insurance coverage to people who would otherwise get treated at an emergency room and cost all of us more money in the end.
They're going to put a tax on people who don't have insurance to fund health insurance for illegal aliens. But let's remember, too, in this country, everybody does get access to health care. You can go into an emergency room and you are cared for.
Right.
So already California is dealing with that, with overwhelming...
Pause it. This is like, she does not realize she is delivering the best argument to provide health insurance to these people. Like, it's, you change your oil every 3,000 miles, your engine's going to be in pretty good shape. You do not change your oil every 3,000 miles. Maybe you get away with 9,000 miles. But then one day it seizes up and you go to the emergency room and it costs a lot more.
Well, she's cornered because she can't say what she really thinks, which is like, let them go without health care.
Right. But she makes the exact same argument that you would if you thought this is a good policy.
He does get access to health care. You can go into an emergency room and you are cared for.
Right.
So already California is dealing with that, with overwhelming emergency rooms and hospitals. So nobody's not getting health care. This is an official taxing of people who don't have, again, insurance. To distribute it, they argue, and 98 million. I think that's going to be a little higher. You know what? This is just after, by the way, they refused. They did not pass a bill that would have given health care to seniors, to Americans who are over the age of 65.
What?
They
Need
said,
it.
no, it's
Yeah.
too expensive, you see. It's too expensive.
That's what's so interesting, because the older ones are not getting it, and they're the ones that would need it more.
That is
This
correct.
is for adults, low-income adults that are illegal, here illegally in California, between the ages of 19
Wait a
and
second.
20.
Wait a second. They're not giving it to senior undocumented immigrants. Seniors who are citizens are eligible for Medicare. They are not giving it to older undocumented immigrants because right-wingers have a bigger problem with that. The 18 to 25-year-old have been brought here without their, more often than not, without their having made that decision.
You would think it would be cheaper for those individuals, because most of those are not going to get sick, to go into the emergency room and just get care.
Wow.
What?
So dumb. I'm sorry. Is that inappropriate of me to say that she's not bright? That for
Cognitively
some
limited.
reason, the idea that if you get sick less, that it's cheaper for you to go into the emergency room is not very bright. Unbelievable.
Sometimes got a water cooler in there, too.
Calling from a 478 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Sam, this is Jeff from Georgia. How you doing today?
Jeff from Georgia. How are you, sir?
I'm doing just fine. Day down here in Middle Georgia, and the whole crew today. Listen, I want to change gears a little bit. I want to talk about Dave Rubin a little bit.
Dave
Because
Rubin.
I've been listening to what you. I appreciate what you've had to say about him. and about why exactly you find it so irksome and problematic, and I don't disagree really, but I kind of have a different take on it. I was talking to some of your supporters and fans a couple days ago about an old Kurt Vonnegut quote I once read. It's real short. We are what we pretend to be, but we must be careful about what we pretend to be. I can't tell you or anyone else exactly how stupid Dave Rubin is. I don't know. I'm not even, frankly, equipped to define intelligence in any sort of like rigorous, testable way. But I can tell you this: when he opens his mouth, he sounds dumb as hell. The things that he says are dumb as hell. The questions that he asks are dumb as hell to his guests. He does nothing but give a platform to ideas that, in a lot of cases, don't deserve to be heard at all, I'd say. And in other cases, deserve to be heard only under the most rigorous scrutiny of the most, vituperative sense. Dave's not cut out for that. He's a baseball player without any arms, Sam. And I'm sorry. That baseball player out there, I'm sure he's trying hard, and I don't want to look down on him for having no arms, but he should find another line of work. That's what I think, Sam.
Well, fair enough, Jeff. That is your opinion.
Maybe you should get 1 million subs.
Yeah.
Maybe I should. I think that'd be a great idea. Thanks for hearing me out, man.
All
I'll
right.
shop there. Have a
Thanks,
good one
Jeff.
now, Majority Report.
What? Where is his? Didn't even get his sound.
Oh.
Wow. There we go. Let's go to the IMs. Matt's sick friend. Sam, can you please say two phrases for the track I'm working on? Have fun with it. Y'all ready? Drop the bass.
Oh, that's going to be good.
There you go. Very sincerely. Thank you. You're welcome. Y'all ready? Drop the bass. How's that? Gregory from Oklahoma. I gave you 2 options. I'm a Gen Z kid, and I don't have much hope for my generation. Most of us don't even know who Limp Bizkit are, and the ones who know who they are think they're an awful band. Also, most of us think the rapper Future makes good music. Don't put all your hope in our generation. I'm basically one of the coolest people who actually gets it.
Oh, my God.
Future's all right.
I mean, I think Gen Z is right about both of those things, but I really appreciate his constant standing of new metal, and I respect it.
JB, Sam, can I use your Pelosi Pete Peterson rant in a Facebook post? Of course. Michael, Greenwald is nothing more than a long-winded contrarian who contributes nothing good to any discussion.
Well, that whoa. I mean, that's just a kind of shockingly stupid comment to make in light of these revelations that they just did. And so please don't be so unbelievably myopic and take seriously this reporting. Myopic? Gee, again, if anything, I'm learning to mispronounce things through exposure to you. Don't be so myopic.
I learned it from watching you, Dad.
Yeah, I learned it from you, Dad.
Well,
you can't pronounce a goddamn thing.
I'm protecting my turf.
Don't you get in on can't say things.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so
it's my hook.
Very myopic. This is the 5th largest country in the world. It's an unbelievably important story. Glenn is part of it. He's a main player in it, and so I actually do find that very stupid and very offensive. I will say, because this is what we're discussing, and this is what the interview is about tonight. And I know some people have raised some things, not that point, but but maybe in another couple of weeks, Glenn might return to TMBS, and we'll take on some of the other areas. But maybe read the report and think a little bit about it, particularly a country that your own government has played a role in subverting their democracy before, being so oblivious to such an important thing. It's actually quite disgusting.
It's possible to criticize someone on some things without saying that they're just trash across the board when that's clearly not true.
One night lemonade stand. I suppose one ought to be surprised by ostensible contempt for public health inspectors coming from the Libertarian primary frontrunner, Sam Seder. James Darwin. Sam, 2 facts to blow your mind. First, there was more time that passed between the building of the Great Pyramid and the reign of Cleopatra than between her reign and today. Wow. Okay. Second, when all the pyramids were being constructed, there were still woolly mammoths alive in the world. Is that right?
Whoa.
Is that right?
I'm
skeptical about that one. Obot. Do you think the House Judiciary Committee is willing to fight for testimony from fact witnesses named in the Mueller report, the majority of whom are Trump administration members and goons? Bringing in MSNBC contributors, no offense, seems like a step backward in the Trump media area. I couldn't agree more. It is... look, the situation is, I think there is a fight between Nadler and Pelosi. And I think that the Nadler forces are trying to bring in whatever they can to push the ball forward. And as a way of putting more pressure on Pelosi. But I don't know. I think in some ways that lets the air out of the tire. But I don't know who you get in there. I'm not sure. Antifada mindset Haver?
Haver, I'm going to guess.
Mindset Haver. Sean from the Antifada said some of the most hopeful and profound things on the show and has inspired me so much. Listen to it.
Oh, I'll pass it along. That's really nice.
HTX Farmer, good afternoon, MR crew. Do you think Nancy Pelosi might be protecting someone or something by discouraging impeachment proceedings? Yes. Her members from purple states and her own House majority status. TMBS fan, to all the MR listeners in Queens, vote Tiffany Caban for Queens District Attorney on June 25th.
Really important vote right there.
Hell yeah. And if you're local, you can also come out to canvass for her.
Rube David, please promote viewers to go to Dave Rubin's upcoming shows in Rockland, California on the 22nd and Cleveland, Ohio on the 24th. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to tell people to go to some show in Rockland, California or Cleveland, Ohio.
No.
On what dates?
The month of June.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, don't do that.
Don't do that.
Seriously.
We show pity.
We know. Well, it's not a question of showing pity. It's just I'm not.
For me, it is.
I'm not. Listen, I don't want to be in a position for encouraging people to do this. Look, what you're doing is not that bad. It's not like, going and heckling a comedian is the oldest thing in the book. Shakespeare, during Shakespeare time, they would throw tomatoes and onions at the performers as part of the theater going experience. Am I saying you should do that? Of course not. Of course I'm not. I'm telling you history. That's all I'm doing. But I think that Dave is, he takes questions at these things. And so he wants questions. And if I know Dave, I know he wants questions that are challenging because he likes an exchange of ideas.
Well, I you're literally quoting the man right there.
Yeah.
I just want to say, getting off of Dave for a second, it is fascinating and quite a testament that we still have Shakespeare's work when you consider how often he was silenced by so many audiences.
You can't even write Othello these days.
Can't even write Othello these days.
Oh, wait a second.
I'm also assuming that there were people contemporaneously who were like,
is this at the...
I don't like that play.
At
so
the
they silenced.
50th anniversary, the Romantic Manifesto by Ayn Rand. Is he speaking
that Ayn Rand
at this?
Institute? Ooh, that's another Koch brother related fund.
That's another great... Wow, maybe you can upgrade that underwear from H&M to Uniqlo.
New partners, Ayn Rand Institute. Thanks, guys.
That would be really... No. Here, though, I will publicly advocate this. If somebody is a creative person who would like to do a reworking of one of Ayn Rand's dreary, horribly written, and philosophically depressing and delusional books, but instead of some type of brilliant alpha architect, if you could rewrite the character as just as an example, say a dim-witted YouTube post, I think that could be a very funny idea. I don't know. It just came to me. It's just in the flow.
It's a whole week? God.
Look.
Oh, boy.
What more is there to learn?
I almost feel like...
Be an asshole. Done.
I think we are not far away, maybe a year away, maybe a little bit more, maybe after the 2020 election, where whenever this stuff comes up, I'm just going to go, folks. I'm going to go for a couple of days, and maybe I'll broadcast into it. And that's all I'm going to do. I think I'm going to take a year where I go to every single one of these events.
Imagine how that's going to work. And we're just doing a normal show. And then all of a sudden she's like, no, it's me on the zip line. I'm here from the Ayn Rand conference where Dave Rubin, I have just made cry. I have added to my life expectancy as we speak. It is the greatest accomplishment of my life. I will look proudly at my children. Michael, can you hear me?
Hey, if you want to go.
Sam,
honestly,
just
like, that is, I feel like a direct quote.
I don't know whether he's crying from confusion or anger or
If you want to
just general
go
sadness.
super gonzo with me, we can both take acid.
No, I don't want to do that. I want to be completely completely aware of what's going on.
This is Sam's
what are you talking about?
He's
He
not
wants
a
to take
gonzo.
acid. He wants to have a precise memory.
He needs
of
some, like,
every single
nootropics.
moment.
Dave, where are you going? We're alive. We're live on the show, Dave.
All right. Well, to each their own.
Yeah. Nick the Liberal. Oh, my God. Nick the Liberal with yet another insufferable transactionalism screed, this time pointing out how Sam was making the case for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker and now lamenting her tone-deaf leadership. I was making the case, and I still, like, do you hear me saying that we should have Tim Ryan to be Speaker of the House?
I have to say, not in the, because I don't like pedant IMs like that, whatever point they're making, but... And I had the same position you did. I'm not convinced from reading about Tim Ryan, and I'm not excited about him running for president. He might be a little bit better on that than Pelosi. He never did the same type of that level of debt hawk nonsense. That I think even those of us who did not like Pelosi but made the obvious calculation, if you had told me that in a couple of months in the future Nancy Pelosi was going to do that, I probably would have just totally sat it out, to be honest with you. I would have just said whatever they do, they do. If that makes sense.
Yes, that does make sense. That's called being afraid to take a position.
It would say like, no, but I mean, would it really be worth?
Sometimes makes
is
sense.
It worth? It's not even. It's like, how much energy would you expend? No, because
I wasn't out campaigning for her. I mean,
we did a fair. No, I think there was value. I'm not ducking what we did. There was value at the time in explaining how this situation actually was working and getting away from just a dumb, one-dimensional, just get rid of Pelosi with whoever. That's still the wrong position. But that being said, if you knew with that, in addition to all of her inbuilt massive limitations, that it was going to go up to being at the Peterson conference, I'll tell you, I would have a different position. I'll own that. I don't know about you.
I don't know. Brock from VA. The fuck gerrymandering page on the Data for Progress lists a lot of good Virginia Dems. Yes, we talked about that with Sean McKelvey on this program several weeks ago. Smoot Court. For some reason, people can't seem to come up with an example of Joe Rogan's right-wingism. So here's one. He peddles anti-trans bigotry. He reduces their lives and rights and challenges all down to a single concern over trans women in the UFC. It's the narrowest possible issue and returns to it over and over again that his audience learns to associate with trans people. Don Julio. How do we get all aspects of the online left to talk to each other and have worthwhile discourse? I want to see Sam Seder talking to Bill Maher. I want Cenk on Pod Save America. I want Jamie and Michael on The Weeds.
What is is that the Vox show? Excuse me. Well, first of all, the way you're not going to do it is by putting us in the least desirable format. What are you talking about? Why don't we get Bill Maher or Pod Save, for God's sake? The Weeds? Jesus Christ.
MV Scott, how is the Mexican legislature going to pass and approve a plan if it's secret? Well, I can't tell you. I'd have to kill you. We got time for one more call. Calling from a 423 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from? Four 423. 423.
Can you hear me now, sir? Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Who's this?
There we go. That was odd. This is Bobby from Tennessee. How are you doing?
Bobby from Tennessee. What's on your mind?
Hey, well, the other weekend you posted something about Ben Shapiro talking about West is best and all this other horse shit. And he brought up Aristotle, and it kind of pissed me off because I happen to be an Aristotle fanboy. So when he talks about doing science for the love of science, what he's forgetting is that was actually Thomas Aquinas, who was attempting to reconcile Aristotelian metaphysics with Platonic methods. And that Thomas Aquinas was heavily influenced by an Islamic philosopher named Avicenna. That was his Latinized name. I don't pretend like I can pronounce his proper Arabic name. And Avicenna, Averroes, Al-Farabi were several prominent Islamic philosophers that contributed to Western society. In particular, Avicenna was one of the first major natural philosophers, which were scientists before modern science, suggested that medical ailments might have a natural cause rather than some sort of supernatural cause like evil spirits or whatever. And he used having too many digits, polydactyly, as the example. And also he had a treatise on medical treatments that we happen to have used in the Western world up until the 18th century.
But now, Bobby.
So in other words, what I'm saying is Ben Shapiro's full of shit.
Well,
yes, sir.
That may be true, but Bobby, isn't it practical to do medicine? I think that was his point. There was a lot of practical. He was talking about practical things. It's one thing to come up with ideas of human biology and physiology, but it's the Judeo-Christians who come up with the stuff just for the heck of it. Did you know that you could stand an egg on its side or something like
Bobby,
that?
I just have to say, it's music. I mean, this examples you're using, I don't know if they'll make the final edit, but they are literally in the Shapiro chapter of my book. So this is music to my ears.
Oh, for real?
And there's
now they are.
No, this is a fundamental building block of the idea of that the West is a fiction. I mean, as is the East. It's a really it's an actually ludicrous construct, and not from some PC perspective. It's just literally not how history works. So that's awesome, and I love how you broke it down.
History.
What'd you say?
Liberal
history, folks. I like how you broke it down so eloquently, and then said, so basically he's full of shit, which also does track very closely with the tone of the book.
Well, hey, sir, if you want a good resource for
please.
Interaction between Islamic metaphysics and modern Christian metaphysics, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if you look up something like probably Arabic influences on the West, something like that, there's an extensive article about all the interactions between the different metaphysical constructs that were built underneath the theological constructs at the times and how they were influenced one another and stuff.
Awesome.
Which inevitably led to, modern science.
Awesome.
Bobby, appreciate the phone call.
Recovery
Yes, sir.
mode.
Hey, you guys have a good one.
You too.
Are you guys in recovery mode after taking on so many high-level important ideas in that call?
Is there a single show that has ever existed that's a call-in show that has this caliber of callers?
No.
Honestly, I don't know,
Bob Grant.
Howard Stern.
Well, Howard
Stern
Stern
rivals.
actually did have some pretty good
All right,
callers.
we're out of time on that one.
Mike and the Mad Dog.
This is Susan Wojcicki. Is that how we pronounce her name? She is the YouTube CEO. And she is answering a question at the Recode CodeCon. I don't know what that is. About the having to respond broadly. I don't know if it's directly a question about Crowder, but the idea that, like, look, you supposedly support the LGBTQ community, but in your operations of your business, it's a little bit harder to tell that. Your marketing department seems pretty good at it. But, and here's the question and the answer.
You started off with an apology to the LGBTQ community, but then you also said that you were involved and that you think YouTube made the right call. A lot of people don't really feel like that's an apology and are concerned that YouTube flags LGBT positive content just for being LGBT as sometimes, sensitive, and yet slurs are allowed. And I'm curious, are you really sorry for anything to the LGBTQ community, or are you just sorry that they were offended?
So first of all, I'm really personally very sorry, and it was not our intent. Our goal was, YouTube has always been a home of so many LGBTQ creators, and that's why it was so emotional, and that's why I think this really. That's why, even though it was a hard decision, it was made harder than it came from us because we've been such an important home. And even though we made this decision, which I'm going to get into a little bit more with your question, but I'm saying we've really, YouTube, we have so many people from YouTube, from the LGBTQ community, and we've always wanted to support the community openly in spite of this hard issue that we've had right now. So I'm just saying people have gotten a lot of criticism, like, why are you still, why did you change your logo to rainbows even though you made this hard decision? And it's because as a company, we really want to support this community. It's just that from a policy standpoint, we need to be consistent, because if we took down that content, there would be so much other content that we would need to take down. And we don't want to just be knee-jerk. We need to think about it in a very thoughtful way, be able to speak with everyone. We'll speak to people from the LGBTQ community, make sure that we're incorporating that going forward in terms of how we think about harassment, and then make sure that we are implementing that in a fair and consistent way going forward. And I think that it was a hard week across the board, and I am truly, truly sorry for the hurt that we caused that community. It was not our intention at all, and I do want to, not that I want to take away in any way from the hurt or the challenge of what happened this week, but I do want to let you know that many changes that we made in the hate policy, which again, is a different set of policies, we think will be really beneficial for the LGBTQ community. And there are a lot of videos there and a lot of ways that community is attacked where we will be taking down those videos going forward. And we will be very consistent. If we see that, we will take it down. So again, thank you for your question. And I really do apologize for the hurt that we caused.
Now, I know that YouTube is a division of Google. I guess it's ABC is actually the company. Alphabet. Is there a way to short YouTube in particular? Is there a way that I can invest money on YouTube having some type of other massive problem? Because, wow. Did she not think she was going to get that question? Was she trying to say, we do support LGBTQ folks, and everything that we can as a company that is not associated with this policy, we're working on it. But the policy thing is extremely complicated because we need to thread a needle where we're not censoring people, where we're not allowing this. I mean, the bottom line is they're hiding the ball, and the ball is this. They want to do everything based on algorithm. They want to have as little people involved in this as possible. This is a business model. And they cannot say that because it's indefensible in many respects. They make a ton of money, literally a ton. Like it would weigh a ton.
Yes.
Even if you had it in like $1,000 bills, it would probably weigh a ton. And they could go out and hire people to do this job, but they want to make it algorithmic. And so they're constantly tweaking the algorithm to figure it out. I mean, I can see it with our videos. The things that get demonetized, and I don't get on Twitter and complain about it. It's not a very high percentage, but it's strange. There are certain words in a title that will trigger it, but then there are ones that you cannot figure out why. Why was the Ben Shapiro when he got on BBC? That one got demonetized. But we have videos saying Ben Shapiro is a moron or something like that, not demonetized. And I think a lot of it, again, has to do, well, the reason why is because the algorithm can't see it. And then they come and they say, we've manually inspected it. But I suspect what they actually are manually inspecting is they're checking that the data around the algorithm is correct.
I think I just want to add to excellent. And I think, of course, the bigger thing is break these up and they're monopolies, and that's fundamentally dangerous to the economy and democracy. But that's a great opportunity to start asking them, when are you going to hire teams of actual human beings, journalists, fact checkers?
Well,
and so on
forget
to do
asking
this?
them.
No. If you have an opportunity to ask a question,
Regulate
you've got
them.
to start. No. I'm talking to the clip though.
Oh,
the next wave of being able to ask.
Oh,
them
right.
effective questions in a public fora, as some would say, not me. And then the other thing, just to add to that, and this is really disturbing, but like they do hire human beings to do one of the most disturbing jobs imaginable. A very good friend of mine's wife works at Google watching basically some of the most disturbing videos in human existence because they need actual human beings to make sure that, I won't even describe it. I think we all know really hideous videos are not uploaded because they can't outsource that to algorithms because there's criminal liabilities and things like that. They hire human beings to do that. They hire therapists to treat those human beings, by the way.
So in other words, they can do this.
They can.
It's that they're trying to expend as little money as possible. And they could come up with policies that a human being could follow, that could interpret like, hey, what is the context in which these words are said? Or why is this audience that maybe just watched something that was hateful coming to watch this too? Because I'm quite convinced when they do a manual review, what they're doing is they're coming in and they're looking at the inputs. And I don't know what the inputs are, but I suspect that, part of it is the content, but it's really more the tags and the titling. And it is maybe a certain amount of the comments, but I'm convinced it's also what videos have been watched by this audience, the last 10 videos that they've watched. And I think when they come in and they do a manual review, my guess is that they're saying like, if the inputs, there's a threshold, right, that triggers the algorithm. If the inputs are within, let's say, 10 to 12%, or within some margin of error that they have established, then they say the algorithm could have made a mistake here. It's too close. We're gonna let it be monetized. Whatever. I mean, I tell you this not because we don't get demonetized that often. I tell you about it just because I think from the perspective of what I've seen, this must be what's going on. Because certainly there are words that we can put in a title. I can assure you that we'll get demonetized. But then there are times where there's no outward reason why this thing should be demonetized if the other thing is monetized.
Absolutely. And just to add really briefly, and those words that we know include words that you could understand, that most likely even descriptively would indicate being like an anti-bigotry position. So a way in which they're drawing false equivalency by the algorithm, right? Like I did a video, I don't even remember on which show it was, but it was something like the global rise of Islamophobia. gone immediately, right? Because and my point being is like, that's a good example of how, it isn't a question of what is this video actually saying about Muslims, whether or not it's a reactionary tract or a left-wing, sort of defense, or even somewhere in the middle of having a discussion around issues related to this. It's just that is a problem word zone. So regardless of what it's doing, it's gone.
Let's get to this too. This is Bernie Sanders was with Harry Smith on CBS. I mean, it's sort of amazing because the media that Bernie Sanders has gotten over the years now relative to where he was able to get on 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But here is NBC Nightly News with My Big Idea, Bernie Sanders, talking about Medicare.
What's your big idea? Medicare for all. Does that mean all?
Yeah, it means all. I mean, let's be clear. This is not a radical idea.
Together we have stood with the workers.
Perhaps because Bernie Sanders has been delivering much the same message for more than 30 years.
We're going up, not down.
Here's Sanders, then mayor of Burlington, Vermont, on the Today Show in 1981.
You have maybe 2% of the population that owns 1/3 of the entire wealth of America.
We met the senator on Capitol Hill in a tiny D.C. campaign office.
Bottom line is, Medicare is the most popular health insurance program in America, far more popular than private health insurance policies. And we think if we expand Medicare over a 4-year period to all people, you're going to see a lot of people being very satisfied.
Americans would pay nothing at the doctor's office, no copays at the ER. He's even throwing in dental and vision care. Companies would no longer offer private health care to employees. The cost in the trillions, with a T.
If I want to, can I opt out?
No.
The word that will come from the Republicans is socialism.
Well, that may or may not be, but as it happens, this is not a socialist program. You know what is a socialist program? It's the Veterans Administration. You know what's a socialist program? Your police department, your fire department. Those are government-run programs.
Medicare for all. That's Bernie Sanders' big idea.
There you go. Pretty amazing to lay it out like that. They're trying to he's even throwing in dental care. And the thing
Vision
is,
and dental are pretty important.
the cost, again, this is really important. To say it costs trillions is accurate, but you also, to get a notion of whether we can afford it, you also have to put in there what it saves. And so it costs billions, but it's trillions, but it saves slightly more. And so the net effect is actually a negative effect. That's according, anyways, to the Cato Institute numbers. So, I can't totally vouch for their numbers, but certainly there have been other breakdowns that show a similar dynamic. But that's specifically, I'm citing the Cato Institute. All right, let's do 6 more IMs, and then we are out of here. Sean. Seeing Sarah, okay.
It's
Dirty
so
530.
awkward on the other side of that when you're just sitting there and you start reading it out loud and you're just, oh.
Dirty 530. What are some good responses when libertarians pose that Dems are the ones who are really in favor of slavery?
Walk away.
Well, what I would do is I would say, could you cite where a Democrat has called for slavery in the past, let's say, 25 years?
When I call for the reinstituting of slavery, we're not talking about the old slavery. We're talking about something that fits with the modern demands of the economy and meets people's needs. Watch, sorry to bother you.
Are they talking about slavery like Medicare for all or something like that?
Taxes.
Like taxes?
Welfare slavery.
Do you mean like slavery, or are you using that word in an incredibly insane, historically illiterate way?
Right, that would be the response. Christo, did anyone read Anand Girdada's cover story in Time magazine about Senator Sanders? He makes the case that while it's contrary to what he wants to, Bernie may need to share his story more to win the nomination and further his political revolution.
He is sharing his story.
He's certainly been, there's been an attempt to get him to do that. Time might not be anywhere as influential as it was, but the author's pretty good at what he does and sympathetic take on. We've had on this program. I would read him anywhere. Chug Toad. Fox is using the language of fascism's othering to set up the punch down from the social dominant group dynamic in order to let the bourgeoisie get idiots to vote for their policies because they are granted tacit consent to punch down on who they've been conditioned to see as others. That is all that is over and over, literally fascism. Sam, it really is fascism. It's insane, but it's not the best part of, even give it any platform, actually. Producer Lauren, do you know if Mary Cheney ever had a dom sub relationship with Tammy Bruce, considering they're both angry right-wing? I don't know. Jay Cool, do you think that on the 5,000th episode of Majority Report, you'll be breaking down an interview on The View with Meghan McCain and Barron Trump discussing the first signs of Donald having Alzheimer's? Congressional baseball fan, if you haven't got a chance to check out Bernie's scouting report footage, you should. He looked good out there on the ball field for being supposedly too old to run. Definitely a solid hitter with good legs. Rando, speaking of time being weird, some people born in the 21st century can vote. Beep-boop. After I listened to your debates with him on my way to work, I got a book proposal from Walter Block in my inbox. I work for a publishing company. I don't want to give too much away, but the topic of the book prompted me to look up his theory of evictionism, which he says is the only justifiable position on abortion. It essentially applies Lockean homesteading theory of private property rights to abortion. From Wikipedia, building on the libertarian stand against trespass and murder, Block supports a right to first act, eviction, within the first 6 months, but not the second act, murder, within the final 3 months. He makes it out to sound so revolutionary, but it just seems to uphold the Roe v. Wade decision and repackage it through libertarian lens. Anyway, weird coincidence, and my partner was really urging me to IM you about it. That's hilarious. Thank you, Beeboop. And the final IM of the day. Are you going to play the tape of Crowder on Ruben's show in which he comforts Ruben by telling him he's not a lisping queer? See you tomorrow.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bulb. But finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I get somewhere the choice was made, for the option where you don't get paid, for the road that bends before it finally breaks you. I guess somehow I lost my drive